Commemorative Air Force Warbird Tube webinar for this evening. I'm your host, Steve Buss, and we're glad that you can join us tonight. This webinar series is made possible by the Commemorative Air Force. You can support our mission to educate, inspire, and honor by joining the CAF as a member or by making a donation. For more information on how you can support the CAF and a list of our aircraft, units, and upcoming events, please visit our website at commemorativeairforce.org. Now, if you have questions during the presentation tonight, please type them in the chat box, and we'll save time at the end to have those questions answered. Joining us tonight is Kathy Mizell and John Cotter, and hopefully Ed Vesely will be joining us as well to talk about the SB2C-5 Helldiver. Well, good evening and welcome to you both. How are things going this evening so far?
So far, so good.
Great to see you. Thanks for having us.
Well, let's just find out a little bit about both of you. Kathy, we'll start with you. What prompted you to get involved with the CAF and specifically the Helldiver?
Oh my! I worked with Sharon Short. She and her husband Ted Short were major proponents of the West Texas Wing, which is the unit that possesses the Helldiver. Doesn't own it. CAF owns it, but we have it assigned to us. We maintain it. We monitor it. We fly it. We show it. Whatever. So between Ted and Sharon, I got heavily involved with the CAF in 1995. Joined in 1998, and have been a member of CAF in the wing since then.
For you, John?
Sorry.
Yeah, I joined the CAF back in, I think it was about 2005, with the Houston wing, and started flying the trainer airplanes and helping out there, and got introduced to the Helldiver because it's based in the Houston area, and it's like, wow, the only one in the world, and that was a goal to aim for, and I was really fortunate. There was an opening on the airplane about 3 or 4 years ago, and was honored to get the invite and come over and get to help promote the Helldiver and share that story and get to fly it.
Well, now how does one go from flying small light aircraft to flying the big-tailed beast, otherwise known as the Helldiver?
Well, I mean, back in the day, they started with primary trainers and went to basic trainers, and then of course the advanced trainer, the AT-6, and then you'd move into the big single engine fighters and dive bombers. And it's not too far from that today. The way the CAF set up, we have to have at least 100 hours of T6 time, plus take a lot of training in the back seat of the T6, which includes 2 what we call fighter pilot checkouts. And we fly with really experienced guys, that's flown Mustangs and Corsairs and those kind of airplanes, and they go out and make sure that we can operate the T6 safely from the back seat. And a lot of people ask, why the back seat of a T6? Well, you can't see anything when you're sitting in the back seat of a T6. And when you're flying an airplane like a Corsair or the Helldiver with that gray big engine up front and the big nose, you're pretty blind straight ahead. So you have to rely on peripheral vision, and that's part of the checkout, to make sure that you're comfortable with that. Because these are national treasures, and we want everybody to be comfortable to put them in that position.
About how many hours do you have in the Helldiver?
Right now, I actually only have about 40 hours in the airplane. Okay, so when I started about 3 years ago, we were flying a regular full schedule, and then we had an issue and had to put a new engine on it, and so it was down for a little bit. And then, of course, with COVID last year, it really limited our flying time. And so that's why 40 hours is a lot, and, but in the grand scheme of things.
So what's it like to tour with the airplane?
It's a lot of work, because it's a big airplane. It requires the same amount of work as like a B-25 or a B-17 that's got a crew of 10 people helping on it. And but we're flying the only one. And so it's just such a privilege to share that. And you show up at an airport and folks ask you, what's that you're flying? And you start telling them the story, and it just elicits more questions. And so it's just really a neat feeling to see the excitement and the curiosity in the folks' face when they come out and talk to you about the airplane.
One thing I always enjoyed when touring with the Helldiver was meeting the former crews that you'd run into, the pilots, the gunners, the ground crews that used to work on and get their stories and talk to them. I don't remember anything in particular, but just listening to them talk about their experiences and how much they enjoyed it and how much they hated it. So it just depended on their point of view at that moment. So.
Well, that's true, and that is a big part of touring the aircraft and the mission of the CAF, and that is to reconnect with today's generation and with past generations as well, and continue to tell those stories of World War II.
Yeah, well, this is a neat one.
Right.
I'm glad you put this up right now. Cecil was his first name, and he flew Helldivers in World War II, and this was in Charleston about 3 years ago, and the SBD was there, and Cecil actually flew both airplanes, and so I was teasing him a little bit. It's like, which one do you like better? And but you know, it's you know, getting to reconnect the veterans with the airplanes and hear their stories, because that, you know, I mean, that's why we're here, to tell their stories.
Well, you mentioned the SBD, and we've got a little picture here of the two in flight. Where was this taken?
That was Corpus Christi.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the SBD in the front, which is the predecessor to the Helldiver, and it was quite a transition between the two. You can just, looking at the aircraft together, you can see a pretty big difference between the size of the SBD compared to the Helldiver.
Yeah, it's you know, the Helldiver is significantly larger than the SBD. You know, like the SBD's got an 1820 on it, so it's, you know, about 1,200 horsepower, where we've got a Wright 2600 of 1,900 horsepower. All of their weaponry was external, so out in the wind. So it, you know, it created a lot of drag for the airplane. Where we had an internal bomb bay, you know, they had primarily 1,000, or I think it was 1,000 pounds they could carry on the center line, where we can take up to 2,000. So, you know, significantly more capacity with the Helldiver.
Awesome. Now, you've been out on tour with the airplane, and coming into the fall season, there's kind of two big CAF shows that are coming up, Wings Over Dallas and Wings Over Houston. Is the airplane scheduled to be at either or both of those shows?
We're hoping that we can make the Wings Over Dallas. We're not going to make Wings Over Houston. Yeah. So the airplane has been out on tour for a little bit. We had a little bit of a carburetor issue that's getting straightened out right now. And so it just depends on how long it takes the carburetor thing to get straightened out.
All right. And where is the airplane normally based?
It's normally based at Ellington Airport on the south side of Houston. When we're touring, we keep it in our maintenance officer's hangar. And then when we're in the off season, our friends at the Lone Star Flight Museum let us stay at their place. So we have a real nice hangar to keep it in, and they have our wonderful display airplane. So it's a great partnership between our two organizations.
And folks, we're just kind of, normally when we do this, we talk about the history of the airplane before we talk about the actual operations of it. In today's world, Ed Vesely was going to join us, and we kind of lost connection with him. So we're kind of skipping forward a little bit, and because Ed's really the expert on the airplane, and we've got some questions already coming in about the history of the airplane and operations during World War II, and I'm not sure how comfortable the two of you are trying to answer those, or maybe give it a shot. And because you've talked to some of the veterans who flew it, gunners, things like that, the airplane seems to have sort of a mixed reputation. It seems to be there's either those who love it or they hate it, and it's nothing in between. Is that kind of been your experience talking with the veterans?
Yeah. That's what I've heard from the different veterans that I've spoken to. And of course, it's been years since I've done that. My understanding is, well, the Dash 5 did not perform in combat. Our model did not fly combat for the United States. It was flown by other countries in their combats after World War II, but it was never flown by the U.S. in combat. But the Dash 1 I believe, was supposed to replace the SBD. There was issues with getting the carriers retrofitted. One of the requirements that the Navy had was that whatever plane was designed as the Helldiver had to fit the existing elevators on the ships. So it limited the nose to tail length, the wingspan. It required, of course, the folding wings. So there was a lot of that ships were not able to be retrofitted. So the -1 did not get a whole lot of combat. I think it was -3 where they really started using it. -2 was not, if I remember, and this is stuff I've read and it's been a while ago. But -3 and 4 were the ones that were actually flown in combat. And they were flown, the Franklin was one of the ships that flew a lot of Helldivers. And our particular aircraft is painted in the Franklin scheme as a acknowledgement to a prior West Texas wing leader who was on the Franklin. And so we repainted it in that scheme back in the 90s, I believe, to honor that ship. And that was Ed has referred to it before, and don't know much about the Franklin, but he's referred to it as a ship that would not sink. And evidently it was targeted by Japanese bombers, severely damaged, but they were able to control the damage enough to keep it afloat, and it never actually sunk. And so it's one of the few ships that was bombed in World War II that was still floating afterwards.
Yeah, the Franklin story itself is an amazing story during their entire combat operations.
Yeah, that's very true. Some of these, it's just amazing what these planes did out there. I can't understand it. I mean, I've always wondered, I've flown in the Helldiver in the back seat, and I'm wondering, got the gun out and I'm playing with it and going, I could shoot off the tail of this aircraft real easily. And there was no block to that. And so I'm sure that happened in some of the earlier days. You just had to learn how to shoot. Me, I'd get gun happy and I'd be shooting at everything and just take the tail right off of it. And I'm not sure I'd like to be in a climb after a strafing run or something, and I'd be facing almost straight down for that aircraft's climbing. So that would have been a weird situation.
And this is the Helldiver was the last purpose-built dive bomber for the Navy. It was the last of a line of aircraft that had a brief but very spectacular career.
It sure did. I believe the record is it sunk the most tonnage of all the dive bombers.
Hey guys, this is Ed.
Yay!
Hi.
Yeah, sorry. I have a dead battery on my laptop. Sorry. And anyway, what can I do to help?
Well, now that you're here, we are looking like to go back in time a little bit, and you're the expert on the history of the Helldiver and this particular Helldiver. So right now we've got some vintage World War II kind of photos of the Helldiver in action. So take us back to the development of the Helldiver and its combat in World War II.
Well, the reality of the aircraft is the genesis of dive bombing was created based on Germany's desire to develop the Stuka. And Ernst Udet, German ace who came over the United States in the 30s, inculcated to the United States military that the dive bomber was very important, which was twofold. One, the fact that it was instrumental in the development of the Stuka, and the fact that the U.S. military looked at it and said, wow, maybe there's a lesson to be learned here. So, it was a bifurcated effort relating to both pre-World War II strategy as to we, United States, and or not in relation to, but in concert with, the Germans recognized the importance of a dive bombing aspect of anti-armor. And that's what the Stuka was all about. And it infiltrated our philosophy, and that created the desire for a dive bomber, which was SBD that then created the SB2C.
And when did the SB2C actually get into combat?
Well, the A-25, which is the strike, was the precursor. The Army Air Corps was trying to replicate what the Stuka was. And the Curtiss Helldiver was a non-folding wing A-25, which is an example of it, the Army Air Corps. Army Air Corps and the Army Air Force, U.S. Air Force Naval, I'm having a problem talking it. The Air Force Museum in Dayton, Ohio has an A-25. So that was kind of the beginning of it. And the reality was the Navy created the folding wing version of it as well.
All right. And then once into combat, the aircraft performed well. As we were mentioning before, there's those who loved it and those who hated it, as we've heard stories. And are those actually true, or is it kind of an unfair reputation that the airplane has?
Well, you're comparing apples and oranges. My experience with the airplane, I've been flying it since 2005, and you put things in perspective of somebody that's 18 to 21 years old, and they're flying a aircraft off an aircraft carrier that's basically the size of a T6, which is the SBD, which is a very nimble, very light aircraft. And I think John referred to it earlier, as it had limited armament, but it was a very, nice airplane to fly, but it was also a nice airplane to land on an aircraft carrier. Now, here comes the SB2C. It's an airplane that's 1/3 heavier, has a whole lot of armament, and it lands a whole lot faster. I've had the opportunity to fly both the Hellcat and the TBM, and those two aircraft landed about 80 miles an hour or less. The SB2C lands at, let's call it 95 miles an hour, which high speed is not an asset landing on a flat deck carrier. So that's one of the reasons why they didn't like the airplane. But as John had alluded to earlier, you got an airframe that can carry 2,000 pounds internal, 500 pounds each external center section, has two forward firing 20 millimeter cannons, and now you've got a very much more significant weapon.
And what about the combat effectiveness of the Helldiver during World War II?
You're asking me?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So, as John, I think, alluded earlier, I didn't know I was center stage, but the point is, as John alluded earlier, the airframe, I think, sunk more tonnage. There's a debate between the SBD and the SB2C, but the SBD was very effective early on, and the SB2C was very effective later on in the war. And when it's almost an apples and oranges comparison. Both were extremely effective weapons, but it was just a function of what the target assertion was, in that, they had the battle, the early days of Leyte and so on, and then later associated with, the Japanese mainland. In February of 45, there were 1,500 aircraft that were attacking Tokyo from the naval fleet, and that shocked the Japanese. So, when you're talking about SBD versus SB2C, it's apples and oranges. One was effective early, one was effective later. They all played their role.
And then at the end of the war, like we've seen with so many warbirds, there really wasn't a use for the Helldiver in the civilian world, unlike like a B-17 or Mustangs. So that's really sort of kind of the end of its story, at least as far as combat goes. How many were produced overall during the war?
Roughly 7,100 SB2Cs were produced.
Okay. And again, there's a few that survive, including the one that we have in the collection today. Ed, for your benefit, we're looking at a picture from Ontario, California, and I believe this is showing our airplane in the early 1960s. How did the airplane become part of the CAF fleet?
Well, okay, so the history of our airframe was that it was delivered to Navy San Diego in early 1945 and was stationed there until 1947. Then it was transferred to Navy Corpus in 1947 as a target tow, and then mustered out in 1948. And it was sold surplus to the Montana Aeromotive Mechanics School in Helena, and it stayed there until 1963. Then it was purchased by the Air Museum in Ontario, which is Tallahassee, and it stayed there till 1971, and it was purchased by a CF Colonel, Robert Griffin. And then it was donated. He purchased it, and by the way, the SBD that is currently with the CAF, both of them were purchased and donated. So it was in 1971 that we owned both airframes, SBD and the SB2C.
And this is a picture taken from Harlingen, Texas, at the air show there, October of 1972. So it's shortly after the airplane joined the fleet.
Yeah, that's pretty cool.
Mm-hmm.
How did how was the airplane operated by the CAF? Was it always with the West Texas Wing?
My answer is, according to my information, absolutely correct. Yeah, it was adopted by the West Texas Wing and has remained under its auspices ever since.
And the airplane, like so many of the CAF aircraft in that time period and today, was regular on the air show circuits.
Oh yeah, it been on and off the air show circuit since that time period. And of course, we know what happened in 1982. But yes, it's been one of the prides of our fleet.
Absolutely. And for those who don't know what happened in 1982, you can just enlighten us a little bit.
Well, sadly, the airplane took off from the air show of Harlingen, of course, which is the CF show, and had an engine failure, and the pilot did a great job, put it on its belly off airport, and it did suffer some significant structural damage, but it was salvageable. And thereafter, the West Texas Wing under Ted Short, Sharon Short, and the West Texas Wing, they sponsored the resurrection of the aircraft, and under Nelson Mizell, and this actually put Nelson on the map under Warbird restoration. It took 6 years to get the airplane back, and it was returned to service in 1987.
And then flew from 87 on, and you just redid the engine on the airplane just a couple of years ago, 2019.
Yeah, that's correct. And the airframe has been maintained very well. Engines and props and accessories are always an issue, but we got almost 1,000 hours out of that engine, and thanks to our membership and donations, we were able to overhaul the engine at the cost of almost $100,000, inclusive of removal replacement, and the airplane is airworthy. Yes.
Following the 1982 incident, were there any changes that were made to the airplane itself?
Well, one of the major differences was the removal of and addition to the propeller. It was a Curtiss electric propeller prior to, which was original, and they put a Hamilton standard hydromatic propeller on the airframe.
And that combination continues with the engine change that you did in 2019 as well?
That's correct. Yeah, we're not going to change that. We're not going. The beauty of the Curtiss Electric prop is it's original. The problem is it's very problematic from a support perspective. So we're much better off with the Hamilton standard propeller.
Are there any other pieces of the airplane that are difficult to come by to keep it airworthy, or things pretty much as much as in the Warbird world it can be off the shelf?
Ooh, hey, John, what do you think?
I think it's pretty much industry wide. Being such a unique airplane, being the only one flying, a lot of the stuff's hard to find. Engines and accessories and things like that. A lot of that's very similar across different airplanes, so that's not too bad. And there's a lot of experience in repairing and overhauling them. But you start getting into airframe parts and things like that. A lot of it's very unique to this airplane.
Yeah. So, Steve, to answer your question, I think John kind of hit the nail on the head. As long as the airframe remains intact, parts are not hard to support. The biggest issues are engine, accessories, and propeller, and those are still readily available. But in the event of you have something unique and associated with the airframe, then we're like everybody else in the Warbird community. We have to scramble, reinvent whatever we have to do to keep the airframe flying.
We're looking at a photo here, Ed, from 2008 of the airplane in its number 32 paint scheme. How many times has the airplane been repainted?
Since I've been involved with it, and after Nelson Mizell restored it once.
Okay. Because paint is always something that it's easy to ding, and it starts to fade after a while. And I just noticed, and part of this photo is probably it's the age of the photo, but the airplane doesn't look as blue as it looks today.
Well, yeah, I'm in the aviation industry, and I equate paint to the human body as skin. So it's very thin, but it's very important. And one of the most important aspects of paint is corrosion prevention. And it's just not cosmetic. Paint is something that prevents corrosion, whether you're talking about exposure to UV or salt or water, whatever it is. The bottom line is paint is one of the most thin, like the human body. It's very thin, but very important. And at some point, we're going to have to repaint this airframe.
Let's talk operations a little bit. Maybe John, you can jump in here as well. Why don't you give us some of the speeds and range, that sort of thing of the airplane, just in general?
Well, like Ed said earlier, he said it lands about 95 miles an hour. I normally flight plan about 200 miles an hour, and it burns about 75 gallons of gas per hour. And it carries 355 gallons. So I'm not going to do math in public. I'll let our folks do that themselves. Leave a little bit in the tank when you get there. But realistically, to be conservative with the airplane, about 3 hours, 15 minutes max. And if we're going somewhere, that's about as far as we'd want to go with it.
What's a normal climb speed of the airplane?
Oh, about 160 miles an hour, somewhere in that ballpark.
All right. And this is just off the top of my head here, but during combat operations, when it was actually in a dive, do you have a clue as to what the speeds were that they would obtain on a combat run?
I'm going to defer to Ed on that one.
Okay, so all right, so are you there?
Yep, we're still here.
Okay, so I'm trying to, I finally got my computer up, and I'm not sure how I'm going to work on it. So I heard the question about the dive speed. And the answer is that the airplane is redlined to 350 knots. So the reality is that the airframe was geared to dive straight down at 350 knots. And that's pretty impressive airspeed. So when the guys rolled on target, they were at 12 to 15,000 feet. They deploy speed brakes and go straight down. And I cannot imagine looking at a target straight down doing 350 knots.
Well, Kathy mentioned before about imagining being in the tail gunner's seat and climbing out and looking straight down. Well, you would have the exact opposite. The pilot would be looking straight down, and the gunner would be looking straight up in the dive situation there. Ed, we've got your camera now. If you could just tilt it down a little bit, we'll lose the ceiling light. There we go.
Hey, Steve, to follow on to what Ed was telling us about with the dive, we got to visit up at Thunder River, Michigan a few years ago. Ed and I were both there, and this fellow had reached out to us and said he'd like to get his dad a flight in the Helldiver because his dad was a Helldiver pilot. And it's like, wow, he was elderly folks, and we were worried about him getting in and out of the airplane. Well, he shows up and he hops in the back seat quicker than Ed or I could climb in there. And he was such a wonderful person to talk to. And he was telling us something that I learned that day, that when they would roll in on a target to dive bomb, they had to close the rear canopy. And so the crewman in the back was enclosed and not out in the open during the dive. So it probably had a lot to do with the airflow over the tail, because when the canopy's open, you actually get a lot of buffeting on the tail. You can feel it up front.
Well, we've got quite a few questions already rolling in from our audience. Let's see, and you've already kind of mentioned this one. Have you met any SB2C veterans? And that was a great story to illustrate, and as you had talked before about meeting some of the pilots and veterans while you were on tour. Here's an interesting one I never thought of. Is the Helldiver bigger than the Avenger? And I guess bigger could be in several different ways, but are they relatively the same size wingspan and length?
Well, I have a type rating in both the TBM and the Helldiver, so I can speak directly to that question. So the TBM has a 54 foot wingspan, and it's a very flat Hershey, I would call it a Hershey bar wing, versus the Helldiver, which is a P40 wing on steroids. It's a high-speed wing. So having flown both, I can tell you that they both operate within the same operational weight, but the aspect of the TBM versus the Helldiver is significantly different based on wing loading, and that gets into a little technical aspect. But higher wing loading means higher landing speeds. The TBM, I've flown the Hellcat. Both of those aircraft land at about 80 miles an hour. The Helldiver, you do not want to land anywhere near 80 miles an hour. You better be wheels and weight at 80. You're going to come across at 95. And by the way, going back to your Steve, your question about the SBD, one of the things was that the airplane was so much heavier and it had a higher wing loading, it had a higher landing speed, and as a result, higher landing speed on a straight deck carrier in World War II was not an asset.
Going back to the dive bomb, how close did they actually get to a target before having to pull out?
Well, based on the manual, it was anywhere between 1,500 and 2,500 feet. The guy in the back actually had an altimeter, and he would call out to the pilot because the pilot would be target fixated, and the guy in the back was wanting to make sure that the guy in front knew exactly how close he was to the target. Because I don't know if any of you have ever flown a seaplane, but one of the most dangerous aspects of flying a seaplane, and I've flown seaplanes, is what's called flat water perspective. So you have no perspective. If you're over an open body of water And bear in mind, all the operations here we're talking about is 99% or open water. You have no depth perception. So if you're diving on a target with an unlimited horizon, you have no concept of how close you are to that target at sea level until somebody says, "Hey guy, you're at 1,500 feet. Let's get out of here."
That's amazing. I did not know that took place, but it makes so much sense because as you mentioned, just being fixated on the target and the mission at hand, you could very easily lose track of exactly how high you were and not have enough room to pull out of the dive.
Yeah.
Do you know where, and maybe you mentioned I missed it, but where was our Helldiver built?
Well, Columbus, Ohio.
Ohio.
And,
Okay.
7,100 of our Helldivers were built. There were 900 in Canadian Car and Foundry, but the balance was Columbus, Ohio. There were the A25s were actually, a few of them were built in St. Louis, but the entire aspect of production was Columbus, Ohio, which, by the way, coincidentally turned into the production facility for the T2 Buckeye, hence the name Buckeye, as in Ohio. So that factory was multiple purposed post World War II.
So unlike some of the other aircraft, Curtiss really kept the production to themselves, and they weren't licensed to other manufacturers for the most part, except Canada.
That's correct. There was, I'm trying to remember the manufacturer, but they built the A25s in St. Louis, but it was subcontracted.
Right. Unlike the TBM, the crew is only 2 on the Helldiver, correct?
Correct.
Yeah. Just going through our questions here. Well, here's an interesting one that kind of gets off the specifics of the airplane, but maybe some opinions that you have. Why our listeners wondering why you think the European theater seems to get more attention in World War II than Pacific?
Oh boy, that's that's a question beyond the purview of the Helldiver, I suspect. But having a father-in-law. Go ahead, Kathy.
That would be an interesting webinar to put together with people from different aircraft.
Separate subject, but here was what I put together years ago regarding the Prowlers of the Pacific air show routine. There were 5,000 square miles of water, of which the Pacific was fought. And if you want to read a great book about what aviators went through, particularly in the Pacific, there's a great Race of Aces book, which talks about the Army Air Corps pilots that flew out of New Guinea and the Philippines. And I'm not trying to belittle what the European pilots did, but when you flew a combat mission in Europe, if you survived the mission, you went home to a very comfortable environment. Flying out of the Pacific, you stayed with the Mud Marines, you stayed with the Army in squalor. And most of those pilots out of the Pacific suffered horribly with malaria. And I can't explain that, Steve, but the bottom line is I think that the Pacific War was underrepresented and the European War was overrepresented. If you are a historian, it's an interesting question, but believe me, the aviators that were home based in New Guinea and the Philippines were incredible heroes compared to and I'm not trying to make a controversy here, versus the aviators that went, flew over Germany and came back to England. It's a totally different scenario.
And I think just from some of my personal research as well into why the B-17 was more popular than the B-24, it seems that the war correspondents had more access to the 17s than the 24s, and they probably liked it a little better. Memphis Belle being one of the things that probably they put it over the top on that. But also in the Pacific, because there was so much to cover in so many places and much harder to get to. I mean, you could be a war correspondent in England and you could be all around the country very easily. It's not so easy to do when you're trying to jump from island to island. So I think that also has an aspect of it. But you're right. The conditions were just very, very brutal.
Think of the aspect of a Pacific campaign. 99% of that combat was over water, and there were 47,000 airmen lost in the European Theater, 8th Air Force. There were 12,000 airmen lost in the Pacific, and a vast majority of those 12,000 in the Pacific were from unknown circumstances. They were either engine loss or running out of fuel. You have no idea. I mean, I cannot imagine being 21 years old, launching out of an aircraft, Helldiver, Corsair, fill in the blank, and going to fly an hour and a half or 2 hours, attack and return. And here's the cool thing. The cool thing is, if you took off in Europe, you knew where your airport was. You take off in the Pacific, your airport's moving at 25 knots. And you hope to God that by the time you take off, fly combat, and come home, the airport is where you think it is. And a lot of times it wasn't.
Speaking of aircraft carriers, has the Helldiver returned to any modern carriers at all during its career? I know there have been some. I think the SBD was on a modern carrier a couple of years ago.
No, the answer is no, it has not. And I would like to have that opportunity, but no is the answer.
If you had that opportunity, if you could, would you be up for landing the Helldiver on a modern carrier?
The answer is no, but I'd like to take it off.
There you go. Let's see. On the SBD, dive flaps are required to be disabled, so they cannot be activated during flight currently. Are there dive flaps still on our Helldiver?
We don't have that same limit, but I will tell you this, and John and Cotter and I have talked about this. Here's the problem with the dive brakes, and this was actually a real war issue. So, I don't know how we escaped that limitation, but if you deploy the dive brakes and they don't stow properly, and let's imagine you fake a dive, and I know one of our previous pilots, he'll remain anonymous, who did that, and they didn't stow properly, he almost lost the airframe. So why would you want to put an 80-year-old airframe into those circumstances? And like, I would question why. You don't want to do that.
And when you say don't stow properly, what do you mean, and what's the effect on the airplane?
Well, the dive brakes are 45 degrees down and 35 degrees up, so you've got a huge spread of drag effectiveness. And if you deploy those and then you dive and you try to pull out and they don't effectively retract, as in stow, you're going to be in a very precarious position.
The airplane's going to want to roll on you,
depending
on what's
likely the airplane is going to make a roll.
Yeah.
And we don't want to do that. Yeah. When you're dealing with a one-of-a-kind airframe, you do not, what's the word I'm looking for? You don't push the envelope, to use a Chuck Yeager term. You don't push the envelope in an 80-year-old airframe.
Do you, and again, just off the top of my head, do you activate the dive brakes when you're on the ground for display, or you just leave them closed at all times?
Well, John and I have both had, the opportunity to exercise the dive brakes on the ground. I mean, that's part of the annual inspection.
Okay.
And it's pretty impressive. But what also makes you appreciate, and John, you pitch in, would you want to deploy those and not have them stow?
Oh no, that would be.
Yeah.
Not about having a bad day. That's a really bad day.
Really bad day. Yeah.
So again, we use landing flaps only. It's the control is a one select control, but you only go aft for landing flaps. You don't go forward for dive brakes, because it's going to not. It may not end happy.
Yeah. Let's see here. Just going through. John, what let's see, one of our viewers wants to know if you fly single engine and multi-engine aircraft, and of course the pilot question, which ones are your favorites?
Well, yeah, I fly
The
both.
Helldiver, the Helldiver.
Helldiver.
So I'm really fortunate, like I said earlier, to get to fly the Helldiver. I'm also flying the B-25 and the B-17 and the C-47. And I get that question a lot, which one's my favorite? And it's like, well, which one am I flying today? But they're all, they all have characteristics that make them fun and cantankerous at times. And so I don't have a favorite. I'm just honored to get to fly any of them.
There you go. That was a nice political answer. Very, very well. The answer, like Kathy said, the answer should have been the Helldiver, right?
Yeah.
So Steve, let me interject this. I've been flying Warbirds a long time, and to support somewhat what John said is, it's an honor, it's a privilege, and it's a responsibility to fly any and all of this, because we are but caretakers of history, and it's nice to be associated with a group like the Commemorative Air Force that recognize that honor, privilege, and responsibility, because it's just not about the veterans of the past. It's about the veterans of the present as well, because 70 years from now, somebody's going to be hopefully carrying on the mantra of the Commemorative Air Force for not only World War II, but Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, and on. This is what it's all about. We are a commemorative Air Force. It's all about honoring our veterans.
And a very important point. I mean, we all have fun and enjoy the camaraderie in the airplanes, but at the end of the day, the educate, inspire, and honor mission statement of the CAF is really what brings us all together.
Oh, absolutely. And John's experienced this, and Kathy, I know as well, and I have. Here's the thing that I'm most concerned about, but there's a hope. My most concern is that I've been doing this for, let's arguably say 40 years, and it's been a privilege to meet a lot of the veterans. Well, unfortunately, a lot of the veterans are, if they're not deceased, they're 99 years old. But the mantra is being carried forward by their children and their grandchildren. And that, I think that's most importantly what keeps me interested in being active with the Commemorative Air Force, is allowing those children and grandchildren to experience things that their parents and grandparents and maybe even great-grandparents experienced.
Well, we have quite an active audience tonight, and this is something that we talked about earlier. The Helldiver could actually be equipped to carry torpedoes.
That's correct.
But we're not exactly sure if that ever happened in combat or not. That was the sort of the historical question that remained unanswered.
Yeah, and I'll have to get back. If you send me that reader's email, I'll be more than happy to get back to him. But I don't know. Since 2005, I've been flying the airplane. I don't know, again, and James broached the subject. I'm not sure they ever actively flew torpedoes in combat, that is.
What do you know offhand? Was there any difference in the airplane itself, whether it was carrying a bomb or torpedoes? Was the torpedo internally loaded or external?
Yeah, I do know that. That's a great question. I do know that specifically. The bomb bay was never built to accommodate a 2,000-pound torpedo. So it actually was all partially external store, like a Devastator, like during the Battle of Midway. Mm-hmm. It was not, the reason why they had an internal store of 2,000 pounds was speed. And the moment you have exposed torpedo leading edge, it degraded performance. So my knowledge, it was not ever done. So I don't know the answer to that.
All right. As we're looking at the picture from the tail side, so you've got the cockpit up front, the gunner in the back, there seems to be a lot of space in between those two areas. One of our viewers wants to know what was in there.
John, up to you.
Remember, I told you about that 355 gallons earlier?
Ah,
So there's a 50-gallon fuel tank, or excuse me, 55-gallon fuel tank there, because we carry 300 gallons in the wings and then 55 between the two crewmen. And then there was also, when it was in service, there was a set of radios and equipment in the back that the gunner would operate. And then also there was storage for safety equipment, like life rafts and things like that. And, you know, if they ditched, so they had to have access to that equipment. And so that's stored in between the pilot and the gunner.
there we go. Speaking of the gunner, can you describe the seat apparatus and the canopy that's around the tail gunner?
Ed, you want to do that one?
No, go ahead, John.
Oh boy. So it's really interesting to look at how it all works. So the back canopy, it slides forward, and then it has a section that's called a turtle deck, which is so you can see right there behind our passenger, that's the canopy is slid forward. And then in the right hand side of that picture, below the guns, that's with the turtle deck lowered. It's hydraulically controlled by the gunner. They pump a little handle, and that recesses down into the bottom of the top of the fuselage there. You can see the ring, which the gun's mounted on. That allowed them to swivel the gun side to side, and then it had a hinge point there that you can't see behind where the bullets are, that you could tilt and also turn the gun there too. And then the seat that Tim is sitting in, he's our passenger, it was adjustable up and down, and then it would also spin all the way around too.
Interesting. I think that's something folks don't realize, is that turtle deck drops down. So when you look at different pictures of the airplane, it takes on a whole different view with the canopy open or closed. It's not just a simple slide back canopy.
Makes a huge difference in the speed. You can really tell it when it's open.
So, Steve, the obvious question is, and I know John's experienced this, and I know Kathy as well. So the question is, what prevents the gunner from shooting the tail?
Nothing.
John?
Nothing.
Two 17-year-old thumbs.
Yeah.
That's what prevents the tail gunner from shooting the tail. So the point is, and it was recorded in combat, that when they were in invasive maneuvers, that the 17 to 19-year-old gunner was shooting at the bad guys, and of course the pilot was doing evasive maneuvers, and of course they never didn't shoot the tail off, but under high G, the bullets would actually penetrate the horizontal and vertical stabilizer.
Wow. So
now, excuse me, Steve, but remember, 17 to 19 years old and you're scared to death.
Yeah. Was the tail gun effective? Effective defense?
Okay, John, you want to answer that, or can I?
Please go ahead.
Okay, so probably 7 years ago, I was able to fly a real World War II gunner who claims that he had 7 kills. And I challenged him on that, and of course he said that he sure enough had those kills. And I often thought about that, because as a pilot, you get the gun camera, and in any pursuit aircraft at the time, you had a forward firing guns, and you had forward firing or forward videoing of gun camera action. And he claimed he had 7 kills, and I don't know if that was accurate or not, but I thought about that for a while, and my perspective was, maybe he killed half of that. But even if he killed 5 as a tail gunner and a B-17 or a Helldiver or a TBM or whatever, those guys may never have gotten the same credit as a pilot. And I thought that was kind of sad in some respect, because maybe they did shoot 5 or 7 airplanes down, but they never got the same accreditation as the pilot. And those guys were heroes in themselves.
Oh, definitely. It takes a certain person to be sitting in that position, whether it's a tail gun on the Helldiver or the B-17 or the 24. It's a different perspective on the world. It's the same with the ball turret gunners. They're a breed unto themselves. One of our listeners has a little anecdote here that says, my mom worked at the Columbus plant in the drafting department, and one design she worked with was on the wing fold lock. She told me it would block the throttle from coming out of idle to make sure the wings were locked down before takeoff. Have you heard that before?
John?
I haven't heard it, but I wouldn't doubt that at all.
So, Steve, tell me again that this young lady's mother worked
at the Columbus plant in the drafting department. It says one design she worked on was the wing fold lock. She told me that it would block the throttle from coming out of idle to make sure the wings were locked down.
Okay, so probably 10 plus years ago, I had the privilege of meeting an author named Jean Levy. And Jean Levy, I did some consulting with her in the writing of the book. This write-in question needs to look up her book. It's called The Curtiss Cadets. And Jean Levy, don't ask me how to spell it, but the title of the book is Curtiss Cadets, and it's all about what Curtiss Aircraft and other manufacturers did to recruit young women into the aircraft manufacturing. And I had the privilege of meeting 5 of those Curtiss cadets many years ago, and they were absolutely a hoot. They were just giddy over the fact that they had been reunited with the airframe that they helped build. And I would imagine that this young lady who wrote in about her mother would enjoy reading that book, because I'm telling you, there was a lot of talent that was pulled out of rural America, young women included, that became engineers. They just weren't Rosie the Riveters, which was a wonderful aspect, but they became draftspeople, engineers, and designers, and it's a story in itself. I would encourage that young lady to look up that book I'm referring to.
Good. And you also have a book on the Helldiver. If people want more information, should put a plug in for that book as well. It's not, you didn't write it, but you said it's a very good reference.
Yeah, I'm not that good of a writer, but Crownwood Aviation Series Curtiss SB2C Helldiver. Let me see if I can. There you go.
There you go.
Yeah, and it's an incredible history of the book, aircraft. But the story is told by the Curtiss cadets as to what this young lady experienced with her mother.
Awesome. Just a couple of moments left. Let's go around the screens and maybe some final thoughts on your time with the SB2C, the Helldiver, either out on tour or flying it. Kathy, we'll start with you.
Okay, thank you. It's one of my favorite planes, and I'm like Ed and John. I'm involved in multiple wings, multiple units, so I get to see a lot of different aircraft. I also marshaled, so I was on the ramp working with a lot of different aircraft. Overall, I have a lot of favorites. The Helldiver has always been one of them because I'm so familiar with it. I've ridden in the back seat of it. I would not want to ride long distance in the back seat of that thing. The seat's not that comfortable, but to me, it's just an awesome plane. Some of the history that I've heard on it, and even more that I've learned tonight, it's been great to find out. And I'm going to have to look up that Curtiss Cadets book.
John, your thoughts this evening?
Getting to fly the airplane is such an honor, and the fun part is obviously flying. It's fun, but the part that makes me happy is when you show up at a show and folks come out. If you get a chance and they get to fly in the airplane, and when you get back on the ground, there's the big smile on their face. and that they got to experience, whether it was a reunite with the airplane or got to experience what their parents were involved, whether it's like the drafts people or crew, grandpa or dad, that flew them. Just getting to meet those people and see that we made a difference, some tiny, as small as it may be, positive influence there, and just to see that, it's kind of hard to describe. Makes it worthwhile.
And your final thoughts tonight, Ed?
Oh boy. So, when I was a kid, there used to be what's called a U-control aircraft, which was a little Cox engine, and you could fly it. And one of them was a Helldiver. And I was only 9 or 10 years old when I had one. And now I'm still a kid, but I'm a lot older, and I get to fly one for real. But most importantly, I go back to my family heritage. My father was a World War II aircraft mechanic, and my memories of aviators of World War II were pretty strong. I was young enough or old enough, I'm not sure which, to have met a lot of World War II aviators. In 1970, when I started in aviation, I was only 25 years away from World War II, if I did the math right. And now they're almost gone. But to perpetuate their memory, I get a tingle every time I walk up to a PT-19, a T-6, a BT-17, an SB2C. It's an honor, a privilege, and a responsibility to bring this memory to light, because otherwise, if we're static, if we are a static industry, we are going to inculcate nothing to the younger generation. One of the greatest experiences I had was flying the Arsenal Democracy 7 years ago, I guess it is now. And the thing that amazed me was that the Air and Space Museum, National Air and Space Museum, always held flying warbirds in disdain. And when they saw the outpouring of interest, they literally, for the first time in history, packed the parking lot on a Saturday in anticipation of the aircraft that flew over the Arsenal Democracy. First time in history, they realized, and I hope the whole world realized, that there's a lot to be learned, not only from static, but from dynamic history, and that's what we represent. The feel, the smell, the hearing, the kinesthetic aspect of history, that's what we're all about. And I hope we can continue it for generations to come.
Well, I hope so as well. And I'd like to thank everyone for joining us this evening for another CAF Warbird Tube webinar. We'll be back again next week. And if you have any suggestions for future guests, please drop Leah Block a note at media@cafhq.org. We'd be happy to track some folks down, and maybe there's some other aircraft you'd like to hear more about, or some of the personalities who have been involved in World War II and aviation history. We'd also like to thank our guests this evening, Kathy Mizell, John Cotter, and Ed Vesely. And I look forward to seeing you all at Wings Over Dallas next month in October.
Yep.
All right. So be well, take care, and until the next Warbird Tube webinar for the Commemorative Air Force, I'm Steve Buss. Good night.
Good night.
Night.